needs much introduction. We know him as a Minion member, as on the board of Hillel. He's a professor of economics at Harvard. He was the chairman of the department. He's recently come out with his new book on religion and the rise of capitalism. And he's here today to talk to us about the Jewish concept of the afterlife and its implications to and growth into Christianity. And here he is.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm delighted to be here and really very honored that Sherry asked me to say a few words based on the book that I recently published. I have to warn people that the subject I'm going to be talking about tonight is absolutely not what stands at the centerpiece of the book. So I was pleased. Irv says he's reading it, and Harriet, so Irv and Harriet will know that the book is really about something else entirely, but there's a lot. It's a long book and there's a lot in it. And so when I thought about my instructions from Sherry, it seemed to me that one of the somewhat tangential lines of thought that I developed would be appropriate for the book. I'm going to share my screen, if I may. Jim, I assume that's all right?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and put up a PowerPoint that may make life easier because I want to refer to some text. So let me see if I can get this going. So the new book is called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Well, but to go back, and the issue that I want to explore this evening with you is the way in which Jewish visions of the afterlife and the end times had consequences far beyond the Jewish world, and including consequences that are still with us today, very much so. And as we go along, I'm going to try to make clear the way in which, as mediated by the Christian society in which we live, these initially Jewish ideas are still very much with us today. Now, the place to begin is with a text that I'm guessing most people already know. It's from the second chapter of the book of Daniel. I'm not going to read it, but you have it in front of you. So I'll give people a moment to read it if you don't already know the text. The setting is supposedly Daniel being imprisoned in part of the Babylonian exile. And so the king to whom he's speaking is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And in effect, the motif here is a replay of the scene in which the Pharaoh in Egypt asks Joseph to interpret his dream. But the whole idea here is that Nebuchadnezzar is a smarter guy than the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh told Joseph what his dream was, and then asked Joseph to interpret it. And the king is putting Daniel to a test. Rather than tell Daniel what the dream is, the king first asks Daniel to guess what he has dreamt. So in effect, there's a test before Daniel gets to do any interpreting. Now, I said that the book is supposedly set in the Babylonian exile, but we know that the book dates from the time of the Maccabean revolt. Think about the mid-2nd century before our era. And as you can read here, what Daniel tells the king is that the king has seen an image, and the image was made of a variety of materials. The head was gold, the breast and the arms were silver, the belly and thighs were brass, legs were iron, and the feet were part iron and part clay. This, incidentally, is where the phrase feet of clay comes from, phrase I'm sure people have heard before. And then the idea is that a stone is cut out. And here you can see the key phrase here, the stone was cut out without hands, meaning without human hands. So the stone that is cut out is of divine origin. And then the stone smote the statue on these feet of iron and clay and broke it down, and the whole thing comes crashing down, and so forth. So then the king affirms that this is indeed what he dreamt, and so now it's up to Daniel to interpret the dream. And again, I'll give you a moment to read the text for those who don't already know. This is all from the second chapter of Daniel. And what Daniel says is that the image refers to 4 different kingdoms. The standard interpretation, Daniel doesn't say, but standard interpretation is that the golden head is Nebuchadnezzar himself. That's the Babylonian Empire. But the message to the king is that as golden as he is, the Babylonian Empire will collapse, and after that will be another empire which is inferior and therefore made of silver. That's usually interpreted to be the Persian Empire, and so forth. And then we get finally to a third kingdom and then a fourth one. And while this is all supposedly foretelling the future, given that it's written in the 2nd century before our era, it's really referring, the fourth kingdom is the Roman Empire. And so, which is still very much in force then. And so what Daniel is doing, the author of the book, is foretelling that the Roman Empire will be destroyed. And you see here it is, says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So in effect, there's going to be a 5th kingdom which will come after the Roman Empire. And this is the standard chart. You see on the left-hand side, there's the dating. Head of gold is the Babylonians, the breast and arms are the Persians, and then the belly and thighs are the Greeks, and then finally the legs are the Romans. But this foretelling so part of what's being foretold here is that the Roman Empire will collapse, and part of what's being foretold is that there will be a 5th kingdom which will last forever. And the idea of the 5th kingdom became a very standard image in all sorts of political views. At the time of the Puritan takeover in England in the 1640s, there was a fringe group called the Fifth Monarchy Men. The Fifth Monarchy Men were called that because they were aspiring for this 5th kingdom to be set up. And although they were a fringe group, there is some evidence that Oliver Cromwell himself was a 5th Monarchy Man. Now, to continue one last bit with Daniel, Daniel explains that this collapse of the 4th Empire is not going to be a simple matter. And here, we're now skipping to the last chapter of Daniel, where he says there will be a time of trouble as never was since there was a nation even to that time. So the whole idea that this is going to happen not smoothly, but with a lot of troubles, goes right back to Daniel. Now, where did the Christians who came along a couple of centuries after Daniel go with this? Well, here's a statement first from Matthew and second from Mark. And because those 2 authors, whatever their names actually were drawing on the same material, it's not surprising that it's the same. And in Matthew, there's the same famous statement that I'm guessing most people have heard many times about wars and rumors of wars, nation rise against nation, and all this goes into a tribulation. And Mark has the same thing, that there will be a tribulation. They're talking about the ending of days, ending of the world as we know it. And this idea that the Christians had, that the end of the world, followed by the fifth kingdom, which for them is the kingdom of God, is to be heralded by a time of tribulation is very important, because for committed Christians, anytime you see something going seriously wrong in the world, this is good news. It's good news because if it's going wrong enough, it says we're getting close to the end. In effect, it's like the bond traders I live with. The bond traders have the view that there are two kinds of news. There's bad news, which is bad because it's bad, and there's good news, which is even worse because it's inflationary. That's the mindset of a typical bond trader. Well, the Christians are like bond traders. If things get really bad, that means that we're moving in the right direction. And what happens after the tribulation? Here's Matthew continuing, talks about the sun going out, the moon going out, the stars falling from the sky, and so forth. And then the Messiah appears. This phrase, the Son of Man, for the Messiah is not a Christian phrase particularly. The early Christians took that over from the Jews of the time. And then the tribes will mourn. And here's something that you have probably heard of before. The Son of Man will be coming on the clouds. And we'll take a look at that image in a moment, sending out his angels, and will gather the elect from the four winds of the earth. And then here's a further description a little later on in Matthew, but also echoed in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians about how this gathering works. And the way Matthew has it is that two men are working in the field, and one is taken and the other is not. And the Greek for taken is the same as the word that gives us the English raptor. And so what's being described here is what Christians call the rapture. So we think of rapture as some kind of ecstasy, but in the Christian context, what it really means is to be taken. So one is taken and one is not. Two women are grinding at the mill. One is taken and one is left. Paul in the first letter to the Thessalonians says the same thing. We who are alive are left will be caught up. And again, the translation here is of the same verb that's being rendered up here as taken, caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Now, this turns out to be a very popular image. Here is a Millerite image, as you may recall. This Protestant clergyman from upstate New York, William Miller, famously predicted that the world was going to end in 1843. Interestingly, the Millerites' word for the fact that the world did not come to an end, this is referred to as the Great Disappointment. You have to put yourself in a particular mindset to think of it as a terrible disappointment that the world did not come to an end, but that was the Millerites' view. And if you look here, you see the Son of Man clearly in a traditional Jesus pose, riding in the clouds. And then what you're seeing here being raptured up, those are the elect. And then here are the people who are being left behind down in the bottom. That's 1843. Well, this has been a persistent motif. I don't know. I'll pause and ask, has anybody in this group ever read a Left Behind novel? I don't see anybody speaking up. When I teach about this in my classes at Harvard, I always ask, and almost invariably there's somebody in the class who's actually read one. This is an old cover. This shows the original Left Behind book by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. Here it says it sold over 40,000. By now, the series has sold well over 1 million books. And the theme of all of these Left Behind novels, since nobody's read one, I'll tell you, is exactly what we're talking about. The idea is that you're riding on an airplane and you're idly chatting with the person in the seat next to you, and all of a sudden the person in the seat next to you isn't there anymore. His clothes are there, the fillings from his teeth are there, the book he had in his lap is there, but the person isn't there anymore. And what's happened is that the rapture has happened and the person has been raptured. Now, Daniel, as we'll see as we go forward, didn't have a lot to say about what then happens after the rapture, but the later Christians did. We're now looking at a piece from the latter part of this is the penultimate chapter of the book of Revelation, written by John of Patmos, not to be confused with either John the Baptist or John the disciple, either one. But in the book of Revelation, there's this account about the battle between forces of good, namely God, and the devil and Satan. Incidentally, in case people don't know, Satan is a proper name, even though people refer to Satan without a Satan is a being. And so it says, talking about seizing the dragon, the ancient serpent. And so this is to be thought of as the serpent who beguiled Eve all those eons ago in the garden, and bound Satan for 1,000 years. And that's where the notion of the millennium comes from, threw Satan into the pit, shut it and sealed it so that Satan could deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years are ended. This is now John of Patmos. This is not Daniel, but this means that there's going to be 1,000 years without evil in the world. And then you can read on, when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan comes back out. There's then the battle between good and evil, and then Satan finally is thrown into, here's the familiar image, Satan is thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the false prophet is, and they, meaning Satan and the false prophet, are tormented day and night. Now, this is a standard image that has had lots of reflections. Here's one, for example. This is a recruiting poster from the United Kingdom in World War I. This is their equivalent of the picture with Uncle Sam pointing at you, saying, Uncle Sam needs you. This is the British equivalent. And what did they use? A picture of St. George, I assume it's St. George, slaying the dragon. Well, it could just be the St. George image, but what it's really about, remember, the World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And what it's really about is, to go back, is slaying the dragon and putting him back into the lake of fire and brimstone. But we see it in other places. Here's another wildly best-selling book, up near 100 million copies, Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth. It's all about the Earth being consumed in this fire and brimstone. But the imagery is very much part of our popular culture in other ways. Here's another one that I'm guessing most people are familiar with. If you, next time you watch one of the Star Wars films, go back and read the 20th chapter of Revelation before you watch the film. And it becomes quite obvious that what it's doing, it's an allegory with humans in it. It's an allegory of the binding of Satan, and of course, the image of Darth Vader is supposed to be Satan. Now, when is all this going to happen? This is a very interesting piece of controversy. Here's something from Matthew in which Jesus was pretty firm that this was going to happen in their lifetimes. By the time you get into the first century of our era, even more so than in the second century before our era, when the book of Daniel was written, the Jews of that time were really eager to have the Roman Empire collapse. So here Jesus says that there are people standing there who will not die before they see all this happening. But nonetheless, there is a tradition that you're not supposed to try to foretell when this is happening. Here are, again, a couple of statements from one from Matthew and one from Mark, basically the identical statement, saying that nobody can figure this out. This is echoed a little later in the Babylonian Talmud. Here's a statement from Tractate Sanhedrin, saying that woe be to those who try to figure this out. And presumably this means that a lot of people, by inference, a lot of people were trying to figure it out, because otherwise, why would the Tanaim and Amoraim have bothered putting into the text that you weren't supposed to do that? Now, despite the fact that you're not supposed to do that, there's a strong tradition in which people did. Here again is the Daniel image, and I was pointing your attention to this historical chronology on the left. But if you look at the right axis, you can see what lots of people tried to do to figure out what all this translated into in real time. There are statements in Daniel that help you predict this. And here's another Millerite chart. This is again from the William Miller, who thought the world was going to die in 1843. And this shows you how he got there. Here again is the Daniel image in the upper corner. And then starting with Babylon, Miller works down and he winds up at 1843. And that's why he thought the world was going to end then. And of course, we know he didn't. Well, this continued to be a strong tradition. Here is what's called a dispensational chart, in which you see a representation of the world from the Garden of Eden right through, the period of the first temple, on over, and on the right, if your screen doesn't occlude it by having our pictures, you'll see the lake of fire on the right. So this is all following the standard image. Here's another one. This one is especially beautiful, as one of the nice things that happened to me when I was doing the research for my book. I wound up becoming quite friendly with the daughter of the person, Edward Hall, who did this one. But here's a picture taken from the New York Times to show you that this is still happening today. So here we are. This is May 21, or the run up to May 21, 2011, in which a group sponsored by the Family Radio Network, which is a Christian enterprise, persuaded themselves, just as William Miller persuaded himself that the world was going to come to an end in 1843. These people persuaded themselves that the world was going to come to an end on May 21, 2011. And this is a picture of them demonstrating in Times Square in New York. Now, what happens after the final battle between good and evil? We now move on to the last chapter of Revelation, and here's again the vision of John of Patmos. He says he saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and so forth. And he saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. And this is his image of what happens when we get to the point in human history that Daniel is foretelling. Now, it's important that he didn't come up, John of Patmos, whoever he actually was, this is late first century of our era. He did not come up with this out of whole cloth. When he says the new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth has passed away, he's quoting from Isaiah. Here it is in Isaiah. Isaiah says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth." And the way Isaiah puts it is that this is the penultimate chapter of Isaiah. He says that the former shall not be remembered. So again, here's it's almost the same. It's very clear. Again, these early Christians were really Jews of a different stripe, and so they all would have known the Hebrew Bible absolutely cold. And he's quoting from Isaiah. But the idea of this new heavens and new earth turns out to be very influential. Here it is again on the far right, after the episode with the lake of fire. You see the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. And the idea of a new Jerusalem is itself very influential. In 1893, there was something in a World's Fair was held in Chicago called the Columbian Exhibition, because it was timed for the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage to America. And the heart of the Columbian Exhibition, this World's Fair in Chicago, was what was called the White City. And the White City was deliberately designed to represent what this new Jerusalem would have looked like. Incidentally, this is the source of the line in America the Beautiful about the alabaster cities gleaming. It's a reference to what we're looking at right now. Here's another view of the White City in 1893, but the image has come right down to our time. Here's another image of the New Jerusalem, the new heavenly city that was put up on the ashes of the former destruction in the battle between good and evil. I assume people recognize that. Here's another one. I'm guessing that since most people on this call are about my age, I'm guessing I'm not the only person in the group who went to visit this in 1964. This is the General Electric Pavilion in the World's Fair in Flushing, New York, where the motto was "Progress is our most important product," and it was all about the progress of the world. And the whole pavilion was full of these millennialist themes about how electrification was going to make the world a better place by freeing people from drudge labor. Here's another millennialist theme about the New Jerusalem. This one is from Epcot. It's the so-called spaceship Earth. And what's is anybody, I'm looking, well, I can only see a few people on my screen at the moment, but I'm hoping at least some other, I've been in it. I was there once myself and once to take my sons, but does anybody remember what's inside the spaceship Earth? It's another millennialist image. The ride inside, this is from Disney's Epcot. The ride inside features the history of communication. And communication is another millennialist theme, because it's all about putting people from, as the text has it, from Daniel, the four corners of the winds. Here's another millennialist theme that we would all recognize. Now, let me close just last minute or two. Sherry, I realize I'm at the end of my allotted moment, but I'm going to take 2 more minutes anyway.
Yes, please do.
And so the question is, are any of us going to survive into this millennialist time, will any of us get to see the new heavens and the new earth? Will any of us get to live in the new Jerusalem? Well, there is this tantalizing hint in Ezekiel. Is Ezekiel talking about human resurrection? The usual answer is no. The standard interpretation of Ezekiel is that, again, this is written during the Babylonian exile, and the bones are a metaphoric interpretation of the Judahite nation. And what he's really saying is that the nation will live. It's not about individuals. The nation will live. And when he's talking about covering the bones with skin and putting breath back in it, and you shall live, is really about the nation. Well, how about Daniel? Daniel is more explicit. So Daniel talks about, this is again what happens after the tribulation. And Daniel is explicit that he is looking for a human resurrection. Daniel says that many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. And then there's this extremely interesting phrase, some to everlasting life and some to reproaches and everlasting abhorrence. Now, where did the Christians go with that? Here's a standard Christian image of the judgment day. And it's all about, here's Jesus sitting in judgment, and here are the humans coming out of their graves, and they're being sorted. And some are being led to what Daniel called everlasting life. You can see here's St. Peter with his key, and here are the others being taken to a different place. When I teach this in my classes, I explain that this side are the people who get their problem sets in on time. This side are the people who are late with their problem sets. But this is the famous Memling triptych. Well, how did the Christians get from Daniel's cryptic reference to some with everlasting life and some to reproaches and abhorrence? How did they get there? Here it is in Matthew, and again I'll let you read it. It's very cryptic. It's a parable, and the king wants to invite people to his wedding, and then he has two problems. First, the servants go invite people and nobody will come. And so then he sends the servants back out into the common thoroughfares to invite people. So finally they get guests. But then when the king comes in, he sees somebody, and all the text says is that the person had no wedding garment. Well, what does that mean? Doesn't tell you. But the king says to his attendants, bind him, that's the person without the wedding garment, hand and foot, and cast him into the outer darkness, where men will weep and gnash their teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. And this, followed by various statements by Paul, especially in his letter to the Romans, this is how the Christians got to the notion of predestination. And here is the canonical statement of predestinarian belief from the Westminster Confession of 1647. Again, I'll let you read it. The key idea is that some men and angels are predestinated unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. And then it goes on to explain that this isn't as a result of anybody's merit, and indeed the decision for each individual happens not only before the individual was born, but before the world was even determined. Now, we don't talk about predestination in Jewish thinking, but I think it comes from us because, again, this is the absolute high church statement of predestination. This is the Puritan Creed. This is the confession that every early person at our university would have recited. Again, some under everlasting death and life, under others under everlasting death. And I think where it comes from is the 12th chapter of Daniel. It isn't common to make that attribution, but I would. So I think even though these Jewish texts were written a long time ago and they've largely disappeared, I think, from our tradition, they live on, and they live on in the religious ideas of many Christians, and they live on in the way in which, filtered through those 2 millennia of Christians, these ideas have entered our popular culture. So why don't I get rid of my screen share? I can put it back if somebody wants to ask about it. Let me see if I can do that. So there we are. So Sherry, I'm through, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. And I'll just close by saying once again, this is not really what the book is about. This is a side thought that comes in. But I'm happy to take any questions or hear what anybody else has to say.
Well, thank you very much for that. And it was a wonderful analysis of those sources. And I never saw that the whole picture like that. I really appreciate it. I was wondering where you saw the role of the Messiah in this. And Daniel doesn't allude to it, but I know it has a very important role in the whole development.
Well, that's right. It is. I don't believe it's in Daniel. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea of the Messiah, or often rendered as the Son of Man, was a very standard Jewish motif in the period leading up to the end of the previous era and the beginning of ours. So when you read in the Gospels all this business about whether Jesus thinks he's the Son of Man, he's just taking this. They're just taking the standard Jewish phraseology, and my understanding is that it means the same thing that we mean by Messiah. Now, we don't in our minyan talk a lot about messiahs, but of course there are Jews who do. I remember when Rabbi Schneerson was living. It was very much the same thing. I remember a magazine article about him in which the author explained that he had gone to the Williamsburg, the author had gone to the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn and tried to interview people about Rabbi Schneerson. And he wrote that a frequent response he got was, why are you bothering to write an article about Rabbi Schneerson? Because by the time your article is published, he will have revealed himself as the Messiah, and your article will be outdated. So absolutely, there are Jews who think this way, but I guess we don't have many of them in our minyan.
I had the idea that there was a very strong belief in the coming of the Messiah before Jesus, and then when the Messiah didn't come, people were so disappointed, and then it opened the way for Jesus to be the one.
Well, that's right. Today, I think most Jews like us render this in the form of a messianic era, and again, there are in the same way that Isaiah talked about the new earth and the new heavens and the New Jerusalem and all that, which was taken over by the Christians. There are lots of statements in Isaiah and elsewhere about that lend themselves to thinking about a messianic era.
I'm sure there are other folks who want to speak, and you can raise your hand like Michael just did, or you can use the hand if you go to participants and put in that red hand.
I see Michal's hand
Yeah,
up.
good. Go ahead, Michael.
Michal,
Unmuting,
there you go.
unmuting me. A couple things. I'm struck when you talk about the images of the tribulations, the final convulsion before the end, how similar they are to the images that are invoked now regarding climate change, which I suppose is our own kind of current version of this, without necessarily the prediction of a perfect world coming afterwards at all. But, and the other thing, I wonder if you might comment about is, it seems to me that if the Christians are totally committed to the idea of what is it called? Oh, a sort of a world where there is, on the one hand, good, and on the other hand, evil. And at the same time, they try to imagine the end of history, which is another phrase that we use now, that the Messiah would bring the end of history. That compels them to make a heaven and a hell, because good and evil remain, but history ends, the struggle between them ends. So you have to have heaven and hell, right? Because where are you going to put all the bad people, and where are you going to put all the good ones?
Well, I think this is a little, so this is a little bit where it comes from. Again, the Jewish texts are very silent on this. They had the idea that people who were dead inhabited some place called Sheol. Remember when Saul gets the witch of Endor to summon somebody up from Sheol, but nobody really understands what that is, and there's no notion that it's a matter of punishment. But the place where it becomes punishment is that passage that I gave you from Mark. That's where the notion of punishment comes from. Although you could read you could read Daniel that way, because Daniel talks about some people being, he doesn't say everlasting punishment, he talks about reproaches. Well, what are reproaches? We don't know. But let me offer another comment on the Manichaeism of the Christians. This is well known, and the debate over the extent to which the Christians were going to take over the Manichaean ideas was probably at its height in the late 4th or early 5th century of our era under Augustine. And they tried to get rid of it, but they really never did. They never did. There isn't in the Hebrew Bible, there in Genesis, there isn't a notion that the serpent is, never says the serpent is evil. It says the serpent has done a bad thing, and that's why the serpent is cursed along with Adam and Eve. The serpent is told you got to crawl on the dust, and man's heel will afflict you, and all of that sort of thing. But it never comes out and says that the serpent is an evil creature. The serpent is just deceived Eve. Now, in Christian thinking that came from this, there was, and to a certain extent remains, because you use this nice phrase, Michal, that I like very much, the end of history. And the real question in all this is, for the Christians, is whether this notion of a new heaven and a new earth is about the ending of the earth as we know it, and whether the new heaven and new earth will be inhabited by humans such as ourselves. And I have a lot to say about that history in the book, but in short, there are a bunch of Christians called pre-millennialists who believe that human history as we know it will be ended with this, and that the people who inhabit that new heaven and new earth and the new Jerusalem will not be people like us. And then there are people called post-millennialists who much more think in terms of a messianic era, like what many of us think and talk about, and that will be inhabited by humans such as ourselves. So it's a great debate within the Christian community. The last thing you said, I want to respond to, not with any substantive response, but just to say that I found your thought very, very interesting by likening the tribulation to extreme climate change. And I hadn't thought about that before. And I should ask some Christian believers what they think about that, because in order to connect that to these texts for them, there would have to be, well, a new heaven and a new earth. And the question is, after rising sea levels and warming temperatures and all that make this planet uninhabitable, well, what then do they think is going to happen?
Well, they're looking. That's why they're sending,
Yeah.
to Mars, right? They're looking.
Yeah, but I think your point is an extremely astute one, and I haven't. I missed my opportunity a few weeks ago. I did one of these podcast interviews in which the person who was interviewing me was the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and who absolutely is a pre-millennialist everything. And that would have been a perfect opportunity to ask him what he thought about that, except I'm guessing he would have denied that there was such thing as climate change anyway. So maybe it wouldn't have gone anywhere. I don't know. But I did find that part of your remark extremely thought-provoking. So thank you for that.
Do you see Irv's hand?
Ben, in your book, you describe in great historical detail the importance of predestination and the Calvinist thinking and Christian history, and perhaps even impact on economics. But here, although you attribute the millennialist and post-destruction vision of Olam Haba to some of the Hebrew and biblical texts, I think it seems as though a predestination would preclude at the end of days the separation of the people who were righteous and not righteous into their outcomes. And I think there is a good deal more of that in I think the Jewish tradition about being the discussion of being worthy of Olam Haba.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, well, I didn't quite understand one thing you said. The predestinarians don't see anything inconsistent about people being separated. They really do. And they think that a small group of people, whom they call the elect, will be ushered into the kingdom of heaven, and everybody else will not just be passed over, but everybody else will be condemned to an eternity of horrible punishment. And
but the elect are not chosen because of their righteous.
No. They are not. That's quite correct. They are not chosen under the predestinarian belief. They are not chosen because of any merit of themselves. Now I understand your question. Yes, So it's not that they are especially righteous. They simply are chosen by the grace of God. That's what it is, and that's what the word grace means for them. It's a gift of grace, not in respect of any merit. So it's one of the great tensions in Calvinist thinking, that on the one hand, people are, of course, exhorted to lead a righteous life, but there's never any sense of eternal reward to come from it. So it's very and I talk about this a lot in the book. This is then one of the one of the reasons why the Christians eventually moved away from Calvinism, because they couldn't live with this tension. They said, well, we, in effect, they said, we're in the business of trying to induce people to lead a righteous life. And if we can't offer them anything in exchange, what are we doing here? And they didn't phrase it quite like that, but that's what they meant. And eventually that found some traction.
Okay.
I saw
Yeah.
Michal's notion thing in the chat about a heavenly aristocracy. You're exactly right. That's a good way to put it. It's by accident of birth, the way people would, if you're born the Duke of whatever, that's an accident of birth. Well, it's an accident of God's grace for the Christians. It's not necessarily your birth.
Okay, so we have a question from Kent and then one from Harriet.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment, because, talk of the afterlife and heaven in the future it makes me uncomfortable. It makes my skin crawl a little. It's not something I like to spend a lot of time thinking about primarily, but I've been interested to see where this conversation would go, because, I grew up in the Bible Belt South with many hellfire and brimstone Presbyterian relatives and family members. I had to sit through many hours of church throughout my whole life. But Presbyterian, evangelical, the whole gamut. I've been through every kind of church service there is for many, many hours. And, I'm troubled with the way our country, a lot of the right-wing religious folk. I'm an environmentalist. So I get really upset when I try to get people to care about this planet that we're actually on, that has limited resources, and we're polluting and, ruining our air and water and all that. And really, it seems like so many people don't care because they're so focused on heaven that they don't, people in these extremely fanatical religious communities, if they care about the earth, it shows that they don't have faith in God. So they're not gonna recycle. They're not gonna, care about anything. They'll pull their mufflers off. Who cares? Let the air stink. It doesn't matter, because God's gonna come soon, and we're gonna be in heaven, and it doesn't matter. And so, like Mikkel's comment about, the afterlife and environmentalism, that really touched a nerve with me. That really basically sums up a lot of my anxiety about this afterlife talk, because I have had to try to talk to many relatives through my life about caring about this planet, the earth, all the living things on it, and they don't care. They just don't care. And a lot of the people in their communities don't care, because God's coming soon and we can just trash this earth because it doesn't matter. And I know that there are many Congregationalists and Unitarians who care deeply about the planet. It's not all Christians, but sadly, the ones who seem to have the media, the televangelists, all that stuff, it's really about who cares about this earth. And
Thank you, Ken. I'm gonna move us along only because I'm aware that we are getting close to time. I know Harriet wants
Let
to
me respond to what Ken said, though, because
Sure.
I think what you said is very interesting, and you may want to have a look at the last few chapters of the book, because like you, I'm very struck by the role of evangelicals in our politics today, and I produce a lot of evidence in the last part of the book showing that they do have very different views on a variety of political issues, but I try to anchor that in the theology of these groups. And it's not something new. It goes way back. The evangelicals have always been very active in what they deem to be moral. I'm talking about the American evangelicals now. Very active in what they deem to be moral reform efforts. So, for example, evangelicals were key in the abolition of slavery. They were key in the temperance movement in the 19th century. But they are very uninterested in exactly the way you say. They are very uninterested in what they think of as secular reform efforts, things like alleviating poverty. That's just not on their agenda at all. And it has to do with this, in part, this view that what they're there for is saving souls, and God will take care of the earth until the new heavens and the new earth come. So I think you're absolutely on the right track.
So
Ben, I think. Oh,
yeah.
I have
Go ahead, Sherry. Go ahead, Sherry.
You've stimulated so many responses, and we have a few questions. I think the best thing to do is to have each person say their question briefly, and then you can respond to all of them in some way. How does that sound?
Sounds like a memory quiz, right?
Yeah.
But we can help you. We can help you.
We didn't bring our, pillows and blankets, so and Rabbi Jim is very strict on keeping the time.
I approve.
So I promised Harriet she's next, and then we have Lauren, and then Lori, and then I think then we'll have to call it a quiz. So Harriet.
I'll just say something very quickly, which is about eternal punishment. As I listen to your talk and as I'm reading the book, I often wonder how the world just continues to exist if people believe all this stuff. Why do anything? But it's really a question about where this notion of eternal punishment comes from. It's just so bizarre to me that people of any faith would believe that some people are going to be eternally punished. And I just can't imagine why people would want to believe that. So I just toss that out as a thought. Now, there were a few other questions.
The quick is you can take it back to Matthew on the idea of all this outer darkness where men gnash their teeth, and behind that is Daniel, where there is everlasting life versus reproaches. That's where it comes from.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Actually, it's more of a comment, quasi question. Thinking about the idea that whether or not you lead a virtuous life doesn't determine whether or not you are one of the elect struck me a little bit like it could be the rules of kashrut. Neither is particularly a good way to motivate people's behavior. But if your idea is that you should be good because that's what you're supposed to do according to God, not because you expect eternal favor. So it seemed to me that there could be an argument along those lines, and it might well have been made in the several centuries of apologetics for this. Again, I don't think it's a great way to motivate good behavior, but that might be the part of the rationale behind it.
Lori.
Mine is more just an observation. Ben, when you were showing the triptych with the sorting going on, the sorting of the people and the sorting of the souls, what immediately flashed through my mind was the sorting of people arriving at the camps.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if any evangelical groups reacted to the Holocaust by thinking of this as part of the messianic plan?
Well, there was certainly a lot of view in the Christian community that the entire first half of the 20th century was the tribulation. I mean, they went, if you think about what was happening in the world, there were the collapse of these European empires, the Bolshevik revolution in Russia, and then the Depression in the 1930s, and then World War II. And the Christians absolutely, the fundamentalist Christians absolutely did interpret these things as signs that the era of the ending of the earth as we know it was coming. Now, did they apply that in any way to the Jews on the boat, the St. Louis? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know, but I'm guessing that they would not have. Well, I don't know, because you see, we didn't go into it, but a part of all of this theology or eschatology is that the heralding of this arrival of the Son of Man is going to be that the Jews will all be reunited in the Holy Land. And this is why evangelicals are so overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. It's why the Israelis don't want to bother with us. The Israelis today are completely, I think, uninterested in what we think as American Jews. The Israelis have the view that they don't need us. They've got a much larger community backing them in the United States, namely, why bother with a few million Jews when you've got 30, 40 million evangelicals, and that's their strategy. But the evangelicals are overwhelmingly supportive of the state of Israel because of the part of the prophecy having to do with the ingathering of the Jews. Now, your question, Laurie, is whether when they saw these boatloads of people, Jews fleeing Hitler showing up in the United States, whether they made that connection. It would be interesting to explore. The answer is I don't know, but it's a very tantalizing question, worth exploring.
Yeah, that occurred to me as well. As soon as you said the word sorting, that was the image.
Yep.
Very strong. Thank you, Laurie, and thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. And again, I'll turn it over to Sherry.
Oh, no, I just want to say that this has been a wonderful talk and discussion, and we could go on all night, and then the rabbis would come in the morning and
No, it's time to say the Shema.
Say the Shema, but unfortunately we will have to end now. But I'm going to be thinking about this talk. It was really fascinating, and I can't thank you enough for.
Well, again, I'm honored that you asked me, so thank you, Sherry.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, Ben.
So long, and thanks to all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thanks so much. Yes, thank you, Sherry.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Jim.